Well, welcome everyone to our final panel for Science and Society in the Age of Revolutions. Panel 5 on Marvels of Science and Sight will be chaired by Samantha Wesner. Samantha is a historian of 18th century science, revolutionary France, and the Francophone Atlantic. She defended her dissertation, Galvanizing the Citizen, Electricity, and Revolutionary Energy in the Age of Democratic Revolutions in May 2022 at Cornell University. Her current book project is an interdisciplinary study of the intertwined relationship between electrical science and revolutionary politics in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So it becomes quite obvious why we've asked her to chair this panel. Before joining the Science History Institute, where she's based right now, she was an arts and science postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto and an invited researcher at the École des Hautes Études et Sciences Sociales in Paris. She's an editor at the Age of Revolutions. And so I'm going to hand it off to Samantha, who will introduce our panel and get things going.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. Welcome everybody to our fifth and final panel, which is going to be very exciting. I hope everyone's still awake post-lunch. There's been a slight change of the program, so we're actually going to have Caroline Douglas's paper as the final paper. So as we've done for all of the panels so far, I'm going to read the bios of everyone who will be presenting in order, and then we will be on our way. So first up, we'll have Sean Silver, is Associate Professor of English at Rutgers University and Director of the Scarlet Letter Press, a book arts and book history makerspace. Past work includes The Mind is a Collection, an award-winning monograph and Born Digital Museum about 18th century cognitive models. He is currently working on a project called The Motley Emblem, a multidisciplinary effort faithfully to reconstruct the marbled page in Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, which we'll hear quite a lot about. Its goal is to align the emergence of the global systems of asymmetrical exchange we now call empire, the modernization of chemistry and other design arts, and what those of us in literature departments quaintly call the quote-unquote rise of the novel. Next, we will have Al Coppola, who is an associate professor of English at John Jay College in the City University of New York. His first book, The Theater of Experiment, Staging Natural Philosophy in 18th Century Britain, from Oxford University Press in 2016, is a critical study of science in and as performance. His current book project, Enlightenment Visibilities, studies the 18th century innovations that structure 21st century modernity by bringing previously unimaginable or imperceptible phenomena into the domain of sensation and knowledge. At the APS, he'll be diving into archival holdings relating to the history of the microscope and various techniques for recording and imaging microscopic specimens. So third, we will have Mary Richie McGuire, who is a PhD candidate in the Science and Technology Studies program at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. She's a historian of science and the environment in the Atlantic world from 1600 to 1860. She received her BA in history from Sweetbriar College and her MA in history from Virginia Commonwealth University. Her research examines the connections between ecological, scientific, and political revolutions. Her dissertation, B. Henry Latrobe, Engineer, on the art and science of translating natural knowledge in an age of revolution, 1795 to 1820, is a biography of Benjamin Henry Latrobe, which examines how Latrobe's practice of natural history influenced his architecture and engineering practice, as well as his politics. Research for the dissertation has been supported by a Virginia Tech Graduate Humanities Fellowship and research fellowships in the American Philosophical Society, the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington, the J.D. Rockefeller Library, and the Maryland Historical Society. And our last panelist for the day is Caroline Douglas, who is an artist and historian of early photography. In 2024, she completed her PhD by practice at the Royal College of Art London, where she researched the role of gender and class in early photography in Scotland, with the support of an AHRC Techne Scholarship. In her practice, she moves across photography, writing, and creative archival research. Based in the United States from 2024 to 2025, she continued her research in this area as the Fedwa Malti Douglas Fellow at the American Philosophical Society and at Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, with the support of the Peter E. Palmquist Memorial Fund for Historical Photographical Research. In 2025, she was also the Otlet Fellow at the Science History Institute, Philadelphia. In 2025, she was elected as an Associate Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, RHS. In 2023, she was awarded the Royal Photographic Society Postgraduate Bursary, the Scottish History Society Alasdair Ross Prize, and an award from the Society of Dyers and Colorists for her research on Mary Somerville and early photography. In 2020, she was the recipient of the Paul Mellon Center Wild Research Support Grant for retouching the archive. She is currently a 2025 Visiting Research Fellow at the University of Glasgow. In 2026, she will continue her research in the United States as a 2025-26 Consortium Fellow with the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. Caroline is a lecturer in fine art and photography at the Glasgow School of Art. She is currently working toward publishing her first monograph on women contributions to the field of photographic invention in Scotland. So that introduces all of our panelists, and without further ado, let's start with Dr. Sean Stelver.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. How's the volume? Could be better. Okay.
Yeah.
Emerson used to say that if you raise your eyes to the back of the congregation, your voice will follow. I want to say a couple of words by way of prolegomenon, and then just jump into this thing. The first is that it's really a genuine pleasure to be delivering these remarks here at this place, because my thoughts on this question began here at this place. Actually, I guess 1 or 2 floors up in the reading room when I was chasing down a question about metal salt mordants and came across this character, Edward Bancroft. The other thing that I wanted to say is that I'm actually going to have nothing to say about the Motley emblem. This is a project that has kind of become cracked off the back of my research. It's not just mine. It's really an interdisciplinary and multi-institutional project to accurately reconstruct a single page, which is perhaps the most important page in 18th century letters for thinking about the rise of the novel, a page which perhaps ironically has no letters on it whatsoever. But this is in a way not a part of that. I'm a book historian, so I'm going to start by talking about books. We know precious little about the physical appearance of Jane Austen's characters. Austen is sparing with descriptions of dress and of the colors and styles of clothing, so much so that we would be forgiven if we thought everyone in them had no interest in the outward marks of fashion at all. But about her books, how her books were clothed, bibliographers have been lovingly exact. The first edition of Pride and Prejudice appeared sewn in drab boards, that is, covers made from pasteboard dyed or papered a color somewhere between buff and gray or green. An 1832 edition of Persuasion, the first edition printed and published in the colonies, right here in Philadelphia, in fact, was bound in quarter cloth, which means cloth covering only the spine and hinge, and similar boards papered in drab. Owners could, of course, have their books rebound, and the majority of volumes that descend to us have been rebound in calf or other soft animal skin bindings. But on booksellers' shelves and the shelves of bookstalls on both sides of the Atlantic, from 1814, when Pride and Prejudice appeared in print, to 1832, when Austen's last book, Persuasion, received its first North American edition, they often appeared in the same palette of colors, a family of hues including yellow, green, gray, and brown, which together were called drab. By now, of course, drab has lapsed into a mild epithet. It has become a near synonym for colors opposite, for colorless, or worse, dirty, dreary, dull. In colorists' terms, right, the color consultants at Farrow and Bell, in my now home state of New Jersey, drab means a color lacking in brightness. But for the first 30 or so years of the 19th century, and really until roughly the rise of a particular form of drab during the First World War, olive drab, of course, drab was having a moment. Stationers' shops regularly advertised drab paper, sometimes leading a list which included pale yellow, olive, and tan. Drab turned up as a style of upholstery, a palette of colors for the printing of calicos, and a family of related pigments made by precipitating drab dyes on chalk. For 2 or 3 decades, drab dominated cycles of fashion. Woe to white gowns, remarked Mary Russell Mitford in 1824. Woe to black, drab was your only wear. The aim of this talk is to describe the origin of that color, tracing it not to the energies of one man, though one man was overwhelmingly associated with its introduction into our palette, but to the conceptual leaps, transatlantic revolutions, and ecological transformations that involved but overspilled him. My topic is the practical skills, materials, infrastructural conditions, and theoretical developments that aligned to produce drab as the name for a fashion. This is because the first drab palette was one of the earliest ways that the chemical revolution of the 1780s and 90s paid off in new manufacturing and marketing ideas, or was put to work as part of a marketing strategy. It therefore represents one place where a paradigm shift led almost immediately to a consumer trend. The opposite was also true. Efforts to make drab vendable were instrumental in modernizing the branch of commercial chemistry which today is called bioinorganic color, and the family of compounds, organometallic dye complexes. Drab was a place where the new theory of bioinorganic compounds was first worked out in print. It was also, for related reasons, a place where money was made from color. At the hinge point of these developments, as both their beneficiary and their victim, was the physician Edward Bancroft. Polymathic, slightly feckless. Actually, okay, on the drive down here, it occurred to me that one of the things that I'm interested in this project is the extent to which fecklessness can be a concept with historiographic purchase. So fecklessness is different than haplessness. Haplessness is like what happens in any Thomas Hardy novel, where a often energetic and competent a young protagonist is categorically at every moment counteracted by fate. Fecklessness is somebody who is basically fundamentally ineffective, but who is swept along by fate, actually finds themselves in some ways being successful. And that's how I take Bancroft to be. And I say that with all the amount of sympathy of a man sort of descending into his middle-aged senescence and wondering about his own moderate fecklessness as a historian. But okay, Bancroft, born in Massachusetts, but he spent most of his life abroad. If Bancroft is much mentioned now, it's usually in sensationalized accounts of his career during the Revolutionary War. Here's the Benjamin Franklin connection. From the opening of hostilities in 1776 to their cessation in 1783, he served as Franklin's secretary, ensuring that the King's Privy Council had full and transparent access to all of the correspondence that Franklin was receiving while he was in Paris. More than one historian has risked calling him the most successful spy of all time, and his only full-length biography dwells on his espionage activity for nearly 200 of its 280 pages. And if there's a claim to be made for Bancroft as having been successful in something, that's it. That's the one thing that he was successful in, but in fact, there's no sign that it changed the course of the war or the outcome of the war at all. And actually, his whole activity was limited to making copies. If, however, we take Bancroft at his word, the relationship is exactly reversed. The war years were an interruption in the arc of his career as a chemist and a medical man, laboring to market a North American dyestuff to the textile manufacturers of Britain. That undertaking, he would later complain, had been his principal occupation for the 25 years spanning the Revolutionary War. He described his activities during that interlude, his role in those complicated diplomatic affairs, as having become entangled in a business repugnant to my feelings, for which he was nevertheless obliged to sacrifice near 8 years of my life and my pursuits in it. And when hostilities finally ended, Bancroft appealed first to Parliament and then directly to agents of the King for compensation for his diplomatic labors, this is espionage, finally receiving a monopoly over the import and sale of the dye that he'd been promoting. But this is less about the story, as I say, of a single man, and more about the transformations occurring at global scales that swept him along and upon which he hoped to capitalize, like the reorientation of government, changes in fashion responding to the global circulation of goods, and the transformation of the North American forest into arable farmland, along with the contemporaneous modernization of theoretical chemistry. At one intersection of these changes is Bancroft's largest single publication, his 2-volume experimental researches concerning the philosophy of permanent colors, which is partly a treatise in chemistry, but manifestly an attempt to market the dye stuff he was trying to corner. So on the one hand, that treatise provides a distinction which remains central to the understanding and categorization of dyestuffs, even in the modern literature. This distinction that still turns up in, like, I don't know, Bioinorganic Chemistry 101 between adjective dyes and substantive dyes. That's Bancroft that produces that distinction. But it's clear that he was researching dyes in the first place in order to advance the virtues of a single dye stuff he called quercitron. Actually, he probably called it quercitron, but we say quercitron now. Bancroft is sometimes credited for discovering that dye, but the yellow flavonoid we now call quercetin was in fact well known to colonial dyers long before Bancroft attempted to monetize it. His contribution was instead merely to popularize and to attempt to corner its resale to British dyers of printed fabrics. The 18th century market for yellow dyes was dominated by weld, sometimes called dyer's rocket, a fast-growing biennial that thrives in weedy land. So pervasive was weld that the very color yellow among colormen tended to mean weld. Pigments from other organic sources earned different labels like lemon or gold. From weld was extracted the flavonoid luteolin, which was either used with alum for the dyeing of cotton and woolens, or made insoluble also on an aluminum basis and sold as yellow lake, or the gouache called English pink. But nature loves to repeat itself, and the botanical world is awash in flavonoids, such that weld's real advantage was that it was cheap to grow and to harvest, easily scaled just by planting more weld. Bancroft's alternative was another of these flavonoids, this one extracted from the orangey inner bark of the North American black oak. And I've got, this here is a sample of the inner bark of the black oak from a pocket of the North American deciduous forest still remaining in southern Maine. Well, that tree, I guess, is not still remaining in southern Maine. This is the dye stuff that Bancroft called quercitron, from Quercus citron, oak yellow. It is indeed a bit brighter and a bit hardier than the luteolin from weld, but that's also true of the rhamnitin that was known to dyers for millennia and that could be got from European buckthorn. Its first advantage was that it was astonishingly plentiful. Black oak is native to the massive North American deciduous forest, which once occupied nearly all of colonial North America north of the Carolinas and west of Mississippi. The North American interior was, in that sense, a vast reservoir of that yellow flavonoid, and since it was being rapidly cleared and transformed to arable farmland anyways, could be got just for the grinding of it. Bancroft himself got entangled in a transparent land grab, not unlike, in fact, the Ohio Company, of the sort endemic to commodity frontiers, millions of acres of timber in Delaware, which he hoped and failed to acquire as part of a scheme to export quercitron as a commodity. And so the opening of the American frontier and the settling of land for farming had as its collateral but distant effect the transformation of the market for yellows in Britain. But quercitron had a second advantage over luteolin, and this is where Bancroft's chemical expertise came in. Unlike weld, quercitron could be made to render a range of stable, relatively light fast colors just by treating it with different mordants. A mordant is any chemical that causes a dye to bite into a substrate. Right? That's its root, from the Latin mordere, meaning to bite. Not all dyes respond to mordants. A relatively small number, like indigo, operate on different principles and so respond to mordants minimally or not at all. But then there are the dyes that Bancroft calls substantives, since they do not, those are the dyes that Bancroft calls substantives, since they don't admit of modification. Turmeric, a spice which also gives a decent orangey yellow dye, is, for instance, so chemically long and snaky that it sort of cozies up to fiber monomers and sticks through lots of weak electrochemical bonds, and so mordants don't provide any advantage. But the vast majority of organic dyes are what Bancroft calls adjective dyes. These rely on mordants for their fastness and even for their color. Treating a fabric with a mordant helps the dye stuff to bond. It also almost always affects its color and color fastness, with different mordants affecting it differently, sometimes strikingly so. Quercitron, it turns out, particularly exemplifies what Bancroft calls the adjectival aspect of mordants, how mordants change look and color fastness, and is why Bancroft became interested in the field of bioinorganic compounds in the first place. As the 18th century drew to a close, two theories of mordants existed, often side by side, which still turn up especially in handcraft manuals, since each is adequate to the practical program of coloring cloth. In the first, mordants are understood to prepare the substance of a fabric better to drink in a dye, sometimes by imagining that it opens up a fabric's invisible pores. This is sometimes called a mechanical theory of mordants, since it thinks according to the way different substances fit together, often with analogy to physical processes. All the process of mordanting, writes the poet John Dyer, consists in opening well the fibers of the woof for the reception of the beauteous dye, and wedging every grain and every pore firm as a diamond in gold and chaste. Dyer was no dyer. And so it's an example of what I think they call a cockonym, like a particularly inapt name. He was a poet, but he's remarkably distilled the mechanical understanding of mordants. By that doctrine, all the process of mordanting involved the dilation of the pores in the body of the fibers, loosening them to receive the dye. Thus, treated with metal salts like alum or copperas, the dye stuff would interpenetrate the fibers such that neither rain nor the sun's rays would have the power to dislodge them. And similar descriptions of metal salt mordants and pseudomordants like cream of tartar and sour bran, they continue to turn up in Dyer's practical handbooks. When the followers of Antoine Lavoisier, however, demonstrated that all chemical reactions, including those involving combustion, were only changes in the combination of elements, it immediately made the mechanical explanation obsolete. And this is despite the fact that there are aspects of dyeing that involve the kinds of mechanical processes that belong to the field called physical chemistry. Bancroft's experimental researches aim to fill that gap. It offers, in Bancroft's own words, the first treatise which adopted the terms of the new chemical nomenclature and the principles to which it relates to the field of dyes. It therefore represents an excellent instance of a document doing normal science after a total paradigm shift. Bancroft offered the first systematic exploration of mordants, which is strikingly like the modern one. Almost all historical dyestuffs and all natural fibers are organic in the sense that they are culled or gathered from once living tissue. But mordant fixatives are compounds involving transition metals. A metal salt mordant, a salt is just anything that can dissolve. Usually we're talking about water. A metal salt mordant releases its metal ions in solution, which form electrochemical bridges between the dye molecules and attachment points on the fiber. Quercetin, or quercitron, comes from oak bark and is therefore a reagent which would be studied by organic chemists. But its fixative is a compound involving a transition metal, and that sort of thing is the subject of inorganic chemistry. For this reason, dyes are also where the field of bioinorganic chemistry was first worked out in some detail, beginning with Bancroft's experimental researches. Bancroft also intuited, and this is really his key insight, that almost any metal salt should therefore work for mordanting. And here's where I'm going to make up for my lack of PowerPoint with a little bit of 18th century chemistry. There's none of the metals or semi-metals, Bancroft insisted, nor any even of the different earths, which does not, in some state and degree at least, possess a power of attracting and fixing coloring particles more or less strongly in the way of dyeing. And not only of attracting and fixing, but also of modifying colors. I'm going to try to project. I'm going to step over here and try to project. This is quercitron in its unmordanted state. Quercitron is in, let's see, and then hang on. And I'm going to put it on untreated cotton rag paper so that we've had just a little bit that we can look at. Oops. Let's see, where do we want to start? Okay. Quercitron on aluminum. Gotta wait for it. Ta-da! But you do get a yellow. Okay, and that's the yellow that quercitron is most commonly known for. Quercitron on copper is the color that was used by American soldiers during World War I. This is blue copperas or copper sulfate. This one's olive drab. Give that one a second soak. I'm gonna let that soak. And then quercitron on iron on the reagent known as copperas, which is ferric sulfate. So the same dye stuff, but three different metal salt mortars. If that absorbs, yeah, it's a kind of a brown color. If I let it stick for longer, it would do a richer color. Let's see, and so this is also true for white copperas, which is zinc sulfate, and stannic chloride, which is a tin salt, and on and on, with almost a dozen other metal salts that Bancroft brought into his laboratory. Bancroft's theoretical knowledge ends there, right? Though he did speculate that chemical bonds might be akin to electricity, he had nothing to say about the property of ions. We now call their electronegativity. But the different electromagnetic pole, different elements that will differently alter the total electrical charge and reflective properties of a dye compound. His contribution was instead his systematic experimentation with far more metal salts than would ever have been present in a dyer's workshop. Caught as he was between politics and fashion, between theoretical chemistry and practical manufactures, lucre and light, this fact about metal salt mordants, which Bancroft saw more clearly than anyone before, instantly suggested a business plan. Dyers traditionally created effects, he noted, by blending dye stuffs. To heighten a yellow, they might blend buckthorn with paler weld. To deepen it, they might mix it with turmeric. Bancroft's idea was to work with just a few dye stuffs, but to modify them with mixtures of different mordants. The convenience of being able to produce all these colors from one dye stuff intersected especially with the contemporary demand for printed patterns, especially on the sort of cottons known as calico. Calicos had historically been produced by mordanting a cloth and then pressing it with wood blocks treated with the dye stuff, usually with alum and then with different dye stuffs. Dyers in Calcutta had, as early as the 16th century, pioneered methods of woodblock printing that were subsequently adopted in textile mills in Liverpool, London, and the industrial Midlands. After Bancroft's experimental researches, printed textiles were instead achieved by reversing the process. Cloth was suffused with a single dye stuff and then was pressed with wood blocks treated with different mordants. This produced finer patterns and fewer steps and a color that matched the brilliance and color fastness of any comparable yellow or brown or gray or green. Bancroft, by the way, makes this point explicitly, in fact, multiply so, so much so that it forms part of the subtitle of his book, and also his pitch for the dye from this pitch for his dye from black oak bark. And so it's fair to say that the availability of quercitron in European textile mills depended on ecological transformations then underway in North America, the transformation of that country from forest to arable farmland. But its demand depended upon an aesthetic preference for printed cottons, for calicos, that had evolved over centuries in the Asian subcontinent. And finally, it's also reasonable to trace the origin of the mass consumer phenomenon we now call fast fashion to that intersection in which quercitron played a small part. All right, I'm winding to a close. These are, of course, the colors which come to be called drab, which is one way that the transformations in theoretical and practical chemistry had an almost immediate impact on the historical color palette, the characteristic colors of the Regency, which is to say Jane Austen's colors. Out were the bright colors of late Augustan England. In was a palette called Drab, an exciting new palette. Of which our modern vocabulary retains only that color, olive drab, but also included yellows, tans, olives, oranges, and muddled grays verging on black. This is one of the many ways that a technical revolution kicked off a quiet cultural shift, how a new understanding of metal salts initiated a different sensitivity to a quieter palette, and is one small episode in the history of color of the sort which tended to prevail before our modern moment. Now, if we want this palette, I'm sure the people of Pantone or Faro and Ball can give it to you. And I, in fact, am modeling for you a modern, I just semi-coincidentally, I wore Drab today. Another connection with Edward Bancroft, I guess. But these colors, the ones I'm wearing, are those that you would get at Sherwin-Williams. They're just like any other colors. They're made from petrochemicals and mixed in oil or latex. They're only in the same palette because we, for some reason, decided to put them there. But these colors here, these are here because they share a common chemical structure. You saw me make them. And at the turn of the 19th century, getting these colors would therefore put you at the cutting edge of theoretical and practical chemistry, would cause you to partake in Lavoisier's insight about oxygen and Bancroft's about metals, would allow you to crack off a small piece of the revolution's political, economic, and ecological then underway, which together I'm calling, meaning to strike a slightly anticlimactic tone, Edward Bancroft's Drab Revolution. Should I leave this here? Do you want to
All good. I just gotta clean it all up.
Do you have a presentation?
I do. So we definitely don't want to short the good people. I've got
What's
quite a show
the
for you.
name?
Coppola, Coppola. I hope that's
By Steve Douglas, McGuire.
Let me double check.
Somewhere.
Katterfelto now.
Is it this one?
No,
it's not.
Sorry.
Oh, is there another one?
Yeah, there's another one.
well. This is one of the that we had 2 hours is great. You know, because there's room to breathe here.
You said you're putting in that link that you sent?
Right now.
Let me bring it up. It's signing in.
While we're waiting, you said that John, the first
So
one
this
was
is,
the World War I Drab.
It's my understanding, yeah.
Oh, no, is this Katterfelto? Yeah, so I was gonna say, I think it was McGuire. I think I had McGuire, yeah. Downloading.
Oh, it could be. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know what it looks like when it ages. Yeah, it's super fugitive. Oh, yeah.
Hi, John.
Very
All good. You know, I'm glad to follow Sean's because we had a bit of a, you know, an in-person demonstration here, a little, you know, sights and sounds here. And so, yeah, I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about a figure from the 1780s, Katterfelto. So, and I was gonna say, if we start it, I'll be able to advance it, right? Hey,
Yep.
all right.
Good job.
So, the scientific showman known as Katterfelto offered an irresistible mix of scientific lectures, sleight of hand legerdemain, broad physical comedy, shameless quack doctoring, and mumbo jumbo oratory in the mid-1780s London. The sheer range of spectacles on offer by Katterfelto in a given day, in a given evening, was genuinely astonishing. I mean, look at that. We're ready for exciting lectures on all scientific subjects. We've got all sorts of stuff, right? And Katterfelto is above all remembered for his tagline, which he would lead off his daily ad copy with the stirring phrase, "Wonders, wonders, wonders, and wonders," which secured his legacy. Indeed, when William Cooper took notice of him in the Task, he described Katterfelto with his hair on end at his own wonders, wondering for his bread. As these ads make clear, the thrills were specifically supplied by his daytime demonstrations of the solar microscope. There were evening performances with all sorts of wonderful things, including card tricks and dice cheats and all sorts of stuff. But what really captured the attention of the public was what happened during the day when he was able to use a solar microscope, which attaches a common double microscope to a camera obscura apparatus to use the light of the sun to project images of microscopic specimens into a darkened room enlarged to astonishing size. And that's what you see behind him there. When Katterfelto began performing in London, there was no mention of solar microscope performances at all, but he adopted them. And his canny exploitation of this technology in the context of a public health crisis, that was what made his fortune and cemented his notoriety. So Katterfelto is often remembered as an electrical showman, much like his counterpart and antagonist James Graham, who appears with him locked in ludicrous and homoerotic swordplay in William Humphrey's 1783 satiric print, The Quacks. Oh, yes. Here we see Katterfelto squaring off against Graham in a pitched battle of electrical combat, where the weapons of choice are massively long and suggestively bulbous glass charging rods, which were the stock in trade of electrical entertainments at this time. Humphreys is burlesquing what at this point was a kind of standard repertory of electrical parlor tricks, which Katterfelto definitely did on his nights when he did electrical demonstrations, and which Graham would have incorporated to ingenious effect in his lewd electrotherapy demonstrations that he was giving at this point in his Temple of Health in Hymen in Pall Mall. Katterfelto, too, would give these electrical demonstrations, but his most famous spectacle, the one that led him to be a purveyor forever known as the source of wonders, 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 and wonders, was not in fact electrical. And a clue to it is hiding in plain sight in this amusing print. It's why he's called the cursed German maggot killer by Graham, and why he's standing atop a platform erected over what is identified as a reservoir for dead insects destroyed by Dr. Katterfelto, with various bugs dead scattered around the stage. Katterfelto became a celebrity using the solar microscope because he was able to cannily exploit two calamities that struck London in the spring of 1782. On the one hand, the spring of 1782 saw a new wave of influenza sweep through England, excuse me. As the physician William Grant wrote, it, quote, seized whole families together, hardly sparing enough to nurse the sick. And by the middle of April, it was spread all over London and its environs. The clergyman Norton Nichols wrote in a letter that, quote, the playhouses and opera house have been shut for several days for want of performers and audience. And we know that London weekly burials nearly doubled between May and June. It seems that just about everybody got sick, and many people did perish. As Margaret de Lacy, a historian of medicine, has explained, the 1782 outbreak was the return of an influenza that had afflicted London on 10 occasions during the 18th century. At this time, though, multiple commissions were formed to study the outbreak, and a new empirical effort to study the infection took on an ontological approach, which began to conceive of at least certain kinds of disease, like this influenza or scarlet fever or the smallpox, as having unique ontologies. In the aftermath of the 1782 outbreak, de Lacy charts the rise of contagionism in 18th century medicine. It was this that led Grant, for example, to infer that, quote, a particular seminium was required to produce the 1782 influenza, which distinguished it from every other fever. He's talking about some kind of thing that causes it, not a disorder in your system. But London at this time was also in the grip of a second alarming visitation that spring. Just as the influenza was gaining traction, seemingly wherever anyone looked, the trees and hedges were covered in insect nests. Quote, "It is an undoubted fact," proclaimed a notice in the March 24 Gazetteer, "that in the climates most liable to plague, an insect much resembling that which now covers our hedges constantly precede that dreadful calamity." Fears of plagues in the newspaper based on these insects that are finding all over the hedges and trees. In fact, England was experiencing a super hatch of the brown-tailed moth, a common temperate zone insect that experiences sometimes extreme population spikes. And naturalists then and now have understood that the devastation can be severe. An episode in early 1730s in France imperiled all the oak and fruit trees between Paris and Tours. And a 2020 outbreak in Maine left 4,300 hectares of forest completely denuded of leaves. The insect does not cause plague, of course, but the nests are toxic and can cause contact dermatitis and respiratory irritation, as a number of 18th century newspaper reports alarmingly testified. As John Lidwell Durnan has written, quote, "The brown-tailed moth outbreak of 1718 must have been visually daunting, as it was remembered for decades." During the infestation, the voices of experts like Sir Joseph Banks, Jonas Hanway, and William Curtis spoke up to explain that the caterpillar would not feed on crops or fodder, only certain trees and hedges. In a series of letters to the editor of the Public Advertiser, Hanway counseled that gentlemen should organize the nest's removal for a trifling expense, if only to, quote, "secure to themselves the enjoyment of a verdant spring foliage." It's really just aesthetic talk. But when the leading lights of epidemiology were convinced that the influenza was being propagated by some kind of contagion, it proved impossible for many to separate the caterpillar visitation from the influenza outbreak. Grant did write about his belief that a particular Siminium was required to spread this disease. So could anyone be really sure there was no link to caterpillars and their caustic nests? In spring of 1782, then, there was an unprecedented public interest in small things. Burning curiosity about the caterpillars that infested the hedges, and that unseen agent that was making everyone sick at precisely the same time. It was, in short, Katterfelto's big moment. When Katterfelto began the second season of his performances that February of that year, he returned to the former Cox Museum space in Spring Garden, where he was the previous year, but he wouldn't stay there long. By the end of March, reports of this caterpillar infestation were jostling up against his own advertisements in the news page. Quote, "Pestilence and famine," end quote, waited on this, quote, "evil plague," warned a certain Juvenus in the Public Advertiser of March 27, while a letter printed the following week from a certain Mr. Patience, surgeon and dentist in the Haymarket, warned under the headline, "Insects, the alarm to mankind," and that a pestilence and famine must ensue if the nests were not cut down and burned immediately. It was precisely at this moment that Katterfelto decides to move his performances to a location in London with access to midday sunlight, so that it would allow him to advertise a thrilling new show each day at noon. He writes, "If the sun shines bright, there will be seen these most astonishing insects, which have been advertised in the different papers, and which have threatened this kingdom with a plague if not speedily destroyed. They will be magnified to such a degree by the help of the sun and solar microscope that every person will be surprised beyond description. Above 100 persons may have a view at one time, as they appear as large as an ox, and are all alive. Mr. Katterfelto has likewise some water where there are above 5,000 insects in one drop, as much as a pinhead lifts up. And there will be seen many surprising insects in beer, milk, vinegar, blood, etc." So, inserting himself into the most urgent debate of the day, Katterfelto began holding these daytime exhibitions that purported to display the very organisms that were causing the influenza, blown up to astonishing size with the solar microscope. Significantly, Katterfelto plays fast and loose with the term insect here. The first time he used it, he's clearly referring to the caterpillar itself, which is not microscopic, although small enough that many of its features would not be apparent to the naked eye. To satisfy the public's curiosity, these inch-long creatures would be shown as large as an ox in his projections, and as he says, a lot. The second time he used the term insect, though, his reference obscurely shifts. And now he's clearly referring to the microscopic insects, most commonly called animalcules at this time, that teem in samples of pond water and raw milk. By offering microscopic views of the caterpillars themselves alongside views of invisible microorganisms that you cannot see with your eye, Katterfelto promotes the idea that the caterpillars were the source of that invisible animalcule which was causing the influenza contagion. In one bold stroke, Katterfelto purported to solve the mystery of the double epidemic and provided ocular proof of this fact through the ministrations of his all-seeing solar microscope. But here's where Katterfelto was only getting started. A day after his grand solar microscope exhibition he premiered, he advertises that the insects he displays, quote, are the same kind by all accounts, which caused the Great Plague in Italy in the year 1431. Over the next few weeks, the rhetoric of his advertising swells. He's claiming that thousands of spectators are flocking to his wonderful microscope shows, which are now running continuously throughout the daytime hours, along with, quote, several of the first physicians of the realm, and, quote, some of the royal families, several foreign ministers, and many of the first nobility are coming to see his shows. Raising the stakes once more, on May 30th, Katterfelto announces that he himself had taken it very ill with the alarming disorder that at present rages throughout this metropolis, but mercifully, he was delivered in his sickness by a wonderful remedy. He immediately had recourse, he explains to his readers, to the celebrated Dr. Batto's works, and there found that he had cured many thousand persons in Italy in the year 1432 in the time of plague. The air at that time in Italy was infested with a great number of insects, as it is presently here. Besides those numerous insects which infest the hedges, at the time of Mr. Katterfelto's being taken ill, he immediately tried the effect of Dr. Batto's medicine and found himself perfectly recovered in 12 hours. Mr. Katterfelto, as a philosopher and a philanthropist, gives public notice that he has prepared a large quantity of the invaluable medicine, which will be sold by him only at the low price of 5 shillings a bottle, which is not a low price whatsoever. So now Katterfelto's added a sideline and selling quack cures to his already wildly popular solar microscope shows. How could the public have fallen for this nakedly mercenary play to palm off sketchy patent medicines in the middle of a flu epidemic? London, after all, had endured periodic influenzas in recent decades. None of the experts were calling this flu. It wasn't presenting like the bubonic plague. So what's going on? I think the idea is that Katterfelto claimed to have ocular proof. Not that this would have passed muster at the Royal Society. Being able to confirm the existence of animalcules doesn't warrant wild claims that they could cause a flu. Yet this is precisely the effect of this novel technology of scientific spectacle. The solar microscope engendered profoundly disruptive encounters with the subvisible world. Seeing evidence of the teeming and grotesque forms of subvisible life in the object lens of a microscope is one thing here, but then seeing them exploded into our own macroscopic world, projected into our lived space at massive and horrifying scale, well, that's quite another. And I think that this triggered a form of proprioceptive dislocation and something like an existential horror. It would seem that some of this same fascination and horror persists as late as the 1828 satiric print Monster Soup, commonly called Thames Water, issued in response to an alarming governmental report about the poor quality of London drinking water. Here, the shocked dowager holds a microscope in her hand, but the image of teeming animalcules behind her that overwhelms the darkened room she's in clearly indicates that she's actually seen a solar microscope projection, which by this point probably would have been an oxyhydrogen microscope, so using limelight instead of bright sunlight to do the projecting. In short, Katterfelto was able to fill his cash box because he intuited that the solar microscope was shifting the very grounds of what was and wasn't real, and what it might mean to be a human interacting with a state of nature that's far larger, far weirder, and maybe even far threatening than we'd ever assumed. Audiences attended Katterfelto's solar microscope performances in the summer of 1782 because they appeared to offer some insight into, and perhaps maybe even some control over, the twin threats of caterpillar infestation and epidemic influenza. Katterfelto dissolved anxieties into wonders, and audiences loved his performances precisely because they were something like a scientific farce, a disorienting farrago of natural philosophy and pure hokum. He's still running sort of flim-flams and card tricks and banter with his sort of assistants at night, even as he's doing all this. So the best evidence for this thesis that it's kind of a scientific farce lies that a recognizable satire of Katterfelto was inserted into a series of farces at the Haymarket Theatre that very summer. July 2nd saw the debut of None So Blind as Those Who Cannot See or Won't See, and the farce ran for 6 nights, a solid run. The libretto hasn't survived, which is a pity, but thanks to 2 pretty substantial newspaper reviews, we know that the play's ludicrous depiction of one Dr. Caterpillar was a pitch-perfect lampoon on Katterfelto, and apparently the very best bit in the whole show. So, with a recognizable satire upon his person, now the toast of the Haymarket Theatre, and people still getting sick, Katterfelto doubles down by referring to the farce in his ads. Wonders are now to be seen at number 22 Piccadilly by Mr. Katterfelto's new and improved and greatly admired solar microscope, but not as imitated on the stage in the theater Haymarket by Dr. Caterpillar. If Dr. Caterpillar could exhibit the solar microscope on the stage in reality without the sun in the evening, he would surprise the learned and instruct the ignorant, and then Dr. Caterpillar would exceed Mr. Katterfelto and all the ingenious philosophers in the world. So he's basically saying, guys, it's a trick. It's a magic lantern. There's no microscope here. But it even goes so far to taunt the players for the comparatively poor showing at their performance. If Dr. Caterpillar had the abilities to take off Mr. Katterfelto a little better, they might have caused perhaps many crowded houses for several weeks, though it was only 6 nights. In fact, the 6-night farce might have been forgotten more quickly if Katterfelto didn't continue to make taunting references to Dr. Katterfelto in his advertisements throughout the period. So after the farce is done, he's not letting go with this. So I've traced 28 advertisements placed by him across 4 newspapers in July and August of 1782. And if you know a bit about this archive, it's Swiss cheese. So, there's surely there would have been many more from many issues that kind of we don't have access to. They all include mocking references to the feebleness of Dr. Caterpillar's pretend microscope show in the Haymarket. And I don't know whether it's because Katterfelto wouldn't let Dr. Caterpillar let it go, or whether they were planning it anyway, but the Playhouse is only getting started. So 17 days later, after None Are So Blind as Those Who Won't See closed, the Haymarket premieres a new farce, The Candidate. The farce itself has satirized politicking and elections, but in the prologue, they bunged in a gratuitous swipe at Katterfelto. So there's a kind of roll call of knaves and fools, and here Katterfelto makes his performance as the great Catterdevil, a candidate, half lost in smoke and vapor. The great Catterdevil fills the morning paper. Wonders, he cries. Good people, wonders, wonders. My solar microscope hails, rain, and thunders. Kind of a sort of a Prussian accent. The Candidate kept up the feud with Katterfelto over the course of its 5-night run between August 5 and August 14. The London Packet's printing the prologue in the daily papers, so in case you didn't get to see the show, you could get the joke in the newspaper. And the farce itself is printed by a bookseller in Piccadilly, right next door to where Katterfelto was set up his own shop. So the Playhouse had yet more tricks up its sleeve. On August 17, the Haymarket debuts the performance of a new afterpiece by George Coleman, Harlequin Teague, which did prove extremely popular. So this farce played for full 23 nights in August and September, with 14 revival performances in 1783, plus 8 more in 85 and 4 more in 86. This was the good stuff, right? Harlequin Teague had a number of things going for it, but it didn't hurt that this new farce once again featured a full-dress satire of Katterfelto by the actor Mr. Wiewietzer in the now familiar role of Dr. Caterpillar. By this point, Katterfelto and his solar microscope were all but inescapable. Consider the 17 August Morning Post, where the announcement of Harlequin Teague's debut appears side by side with Katterfelto's protestation that his exhibition far outshines those of Dr. Katterfelto in the Haymarket. So there's the Haymarket advertisement far left, and here's Katterfelto's right next to it. So again, we go to these newspaper reviews to reconstruct what was likely going on. As a farce, there's no script, so there's a libretto of the songs, but you don't really get an account of what the business of the play was. 2 days after the premiere, the Morning Chronicle wrote that Mr. Coleman has retorted that on the advertiser of wonders, Katterfelto, for his reply on the public plinths to the ridicule he felt from the representation of Dr. Caterpillar, and has raised a most hearty laugh at the expense of the German and his solar microscope. Those who have ever seen the noted philosopher must confess that Wiewietzer was his counterpart. Parker's pronounced that it was the best scene of the piece. There's infinite humor in this caricature, and Mr. Wiewietzer is admirable in his German dialect and his imitation of this modern philosopher. Dr. Caterpillar kept the audience in a roar. So I've been reporting on this controversy as if it was a feud, but I think that oversimplifies this media event. Parker's general advertiser speculated that there must have been a compact between the Haymarket Theatre and Dr. Katterfelto to puff one another into notice. For there cannot be a stronger inducement in the favor of Mr. Katterfelto than the ridicule of Saturday Night. Wow, I've got to see this guy, right? So in doing that, they affirm the truism, of course, that there's no such thing as bad publicity, but their analysis suggests that a ridiculous medley of fact and fiction, instruction and imposture was precisely what audiences went looking for when they patronized Katterfelto's wonder-working exhibitions. With Harlequin Teague pulling in audiences just about every single night, that the Haymarket Theatre was open in August and September, and Katterfelto keeping up a steady drumbeat of advertisements in the morning papers, the solar microscope had attained an unprecedented level of popular awareness. What's more, it seems that a wide popular audience learned from the exhibitions of Katterfelto and the farces of the Haymarket that experiences engendered by the solar microscope involved an inextricable entanglement of fact and wonder and fiction and spectacle. So thank you.
Haven't had, like Samuel Johnson. You've been in his house in London. There's a statue cat outside. That was unusual. Yeah, it was unusual. Yeah. Maybe, yeah.
I was wondering if it was just a reference to his name.
There we go. Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. Speak about Benjamin Henry Latrobe. Benjamin Henry Latrobe, journal entry, April 7th, 1796. There are, I believe, few towns, places, or counties that have not a namesake in North America. In few cases has similarity of situation had the smallest influence upon the sameness of name. Richmond, however, is the exception to this remark. The windings of the James River have so much the same cast as those of the Thames. The amphitheater of the hills covered partly with wood, partly with buildings, and the opposite shore with the town of Manchester in front and the fields and woods in the rear, are so like the range of hills on the south bank of the Thames, the situation of Twickenham in the north, backed by the neighboring woody parks. That is, a man could be imperceptibly and in an instant conveyed from one side of the Atlantic to the other. He might hesitate for some minutes before he could discover the difference. As Latrobe observed, the hills of Richmond, Virginia, and the bend in the James River made the resemblance to the city's namesake uncanny. The geographical differences would be little noticed by the contemporary traveler. While Richmond, England is built on the south bank of the River Thames, Richmond, Virginia is built on the north bank of the James River. And while there remained an abundance of wood in Richmond, most of the woodland bordering the Thames was gone. When, however, the whole country was in wood, Latrobe imagined, I am convinced that it is the general similarity of characters of the two situations that impressed upon this spot the name of Richmond. However, the observant traveler would soon realize that the rough frontier-like quality of the landscape, together with the thundering roar of water over the massive rock falls, would signal that he was in a very different place. Latrobe noted, the perfection of cultivation in the first instance, in the second, the grandeur of nature, would fill his mind. Rather than the small and neat islands of the Thames, the islands of James River are towering into a woody hill which separate the curled stream of the James River. Rather than the neat lawns and walks fronting the Thames, wild trees growing among the irregular islands and the rambling edifices of Manchester would bewilder his attention, as much as the rough roads and wooden inelegant fences. The falls of James River, Latrobe wrote, are like an impatient torrent tumbling over huge masses of granite. This presentation will examine how Latrobe's practice of natural history from 1796 to 1798 informed his survey of the Susquehanna River in 1801, and then how this practice shaped the Susquehanna River survey map completed in 1802. Landing in Norfolk, Virginia, sometime within the second week of March 1796, Latrobe began to explore the Atlantic coast and Chesapeake rivers. What kindled Latrobe's sense of wonder was the geology of the fall line that spanned the eastern seaboard of his adopted country. This newfound interest in the geology of the Chesapeake rivers found expression in Latrobe's artistic, scientific, and engineering practice. The British-born Latrobe, eager to embrace the promise of American life, observed the complex relationships between the human and non-human worlds of the Chesapeake with an engaging sense of curiosity. Although overlooked by historians of science and the environment, Latrobe's essays, sketches, and finished watercolors present a view of the natural and the human-built landscape that, as it was being shaped by a rapidly changing world, both politically, socially, and ecologically. Latrobe's journals and sketchbooks document this observation of land use, flora, and fauna as he traveled throughout the easternmost parts of the James River, Rappahannock River, and Potomac River watersheds. In 1799, Latrobe published his first paper on natural history, Memoir on the Sandhills of Cape Henry in Virginia in the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society. And here you can see on the left his notes and watercolors of Cape Henry, and on the right his publications, which the illustration came directly from his own watercolor. Another published paper on the Bay alewife observed in the York River soon followed in 1800, thus formally establishing his reputation as a naturalist. The sketches and finished watercolors that fill the sketchbooks are as essential to Latrobe's scientific practice as are his descriptive, historical, and technical notes recorded in the journals. These notes from the field, together with the published essays that later came from those observations, act as an historical and ecological ethnography of these political and ecological revolutions. In the fall of 1801, Latrobe was appointed by Pennsylvania Governor Thomas McCain to survey the Susquehanna from Columbia, Pennsylvania to Havre de Grace, Maryland. The purpose of the survey was the improvement of navigation along the lower Susquehanna. Like a filmmaker's storyboard, Latrobe's field notebooks and sketchbooks capture the Susquehanna and the people who inhabited the river valley in a moment in time. Latrobe's composition of the map itself tells the unique geological story of a section of river that is as old as time. And by Chesapeake rivers, I am referring to the rivers with the mouths on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. And here we have two maps of the Chesapeake Bay, several hundred years between each. The map John Smith did after his exploration, and then a satellite image. Each of the Chesapeake rivers tells a story both in geologic time and in human time. For much of human history, work and energy have linked humans and rivers, humans and natures, writes environmental historian Richard White. And the river was felt in human bones and sinews. Human beings knew the river through the work the river demanded of them. Generations of chroniclers, geographers, scientists, and historians have sought to tell the story of the Chesapeake Bay region since the 16th century, or 17th century. Thus far shall thou go and no farther, exclaimed Latrobe when describing the Chesapeake fall line to his friend Dr. Giambattista Scandella in May 1798. In alluding to this passage from Job, Latrobe chose a familiar part of scripture that communicated to Scandella the drama of the falls within the landscape. Hitherto shalt thou come, but no further, and here shall thou proud waves be stayed. This verse also told Scandella how the fall line functioned in the working of these rivers. And perhaps Latrobe was thinking about this verse when he chose to frame his watercolor sketch of the lower end of the falls of James River. Seaworthy vessels could not sail past the fall line, and in 1796, Rocket's Landing remained the last stop on the James River. Three of the major Chesapeake rivers, Latrobe observed, the James, the Potomac, and the Susquehanna, rise on the westward of the Blue Ridge, and another three, the York, the Rappahannock, and the Patapsco, rise on the east side of the mountains. The distinguishing feature of all of these rivers, Latrobe writes, is that below, that is to the eastward of the Blue Ridge, is a ridge of granite rock running in a direction nearly parallel, but rather approaching to the Blue Ridge as it proceeds to the northward. This rampart of granite is the boundary line of the tides. Early English adventurers found navigating and settling the Chesapeake waterways to be a challenge. John Page Williams, retired senior naturalist for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, pointed out that, quote, even though Great Britain is liberally endowed with rivers, somehow the English who came to the Chesapeake in 1607 didn't understand that the waterways of the New World work the same way. Richard White provides a useful metaphor for thinking about the Chesapeake rivers as organic machines. Quote, all natural features move, but few natural features move so obviously as rivers, White explains. Like us, rivers work. They rearrange the world. But did the rivers of the Chesapeake, these organic machines, really work like English rivers? How did these waterways support the human and non-human life living within the Tidewater and Piedmont region? And what challenges did these rivers present to early Americans seeking to build a national economy? Those are the questions that Latrobe sought to answer in the 20 years he lived and worked within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The fall line is not a static geographic line, but rather a dynamic geologic zone where the upland Piedmont transitions to the coastal plain. Each river has carved its own channel, noted naturalist John Page Williams, characteristic of the rocks under its bed. The James, Rappahannock, and Potomac rivers, originating in the Blue Ridge and Allegheny Mountains, with a high flow of water, have fall zones that are miles in length. Smaller rivers originating in the Piedmont of Central Virginia, such as the Pamunkey and Mattaponi, which converge at West Point to form the York River, have fall lines that are measurable in feet. Latrobe estimated that the fall zone of the James, with a drop of about 120 feet, stretched 6 to 7 miles from Tuckahoe Creek west of Richmond to Shockoe Creek, then in the middle of the city. The spring of 1796 was uncommonly dry, and the water flow of the river was uncommonly low. Latrobe wrote that the abrupt breaks in the stream exposed the descent over an extremely irregular stratum of granite. In some places, the stream is interrupted for a half a mile together, he continued, and in others, the rocks are very thickly scattered across the whole river. Just as the fall line marked a place of significant transition between two physiographic regions, so too does the zone mark a significant place for the human-built environment. There is an important connection developed over time between the geology of a place and human design. These towns share common characteristics for supporting human life, such as easy access to supplies of food, fuel, building materials, and transportation routes. When Latrobe first arrived in Richmond, he noticed that Black boatmen, enslaved and free, dominated the transportation of goods through the falls of both the James and Appomattox rivers, from the backcountry farms of the Piedmont to the market towns of the coastal plain. Latrobe experienced a passage through the falls of James River around Washington's Island in a canoe navigated by two Black boatmen who he called fishermen. One stood at each end with a pole about 10 feet long. Their dexterity in making united operation of their exertions and the force and direction of the torrent effect a safe voyage was admirable. The confidence that was sufficient to make me trust myself with them failed me at the first sluice we passed, and I have no stomach for such another expedition. The fishermen, however, made nothing of it. Above the falls, had bateau plied the rivers. Bateau is a lightweight, 60-foot long, 6-foot wide cargo boat with a depth of 2 feet. It could transport a load of up to 1,000 pounds. And Latrobe writes, with some difficulty and much care and dexterity, even a bateau might be safely carried through the falls, but not in so dry a season as present. Because of its shallow depth and sleek design, a bateau could float down the river and the falls with hogsheads of tobacco, bushels of wheat, barrels of flour, or coal. Once the cargo was unloaded in Richmond or Petersburg, the bateau would be loaded with goods such as sugar, salt, and coffee, and poled back up river as far as Lynchburg or Farmville. Each bateau required 3 men to guide and pole the boat through the water. No matter the kind of boat, canoe, or bateau, the changeable water flow determined the navigability of the falls. Too heavy a flow of water made it difficult to control the boat. Too little water made navigation impossible. To remedy the navigational challenges presented by the fall line, local farmers, millers, and merchants along the Chesapeake rivers formed shareholding companies to clear parts of the river channel closest to the riverbank of sediment and debris, and to construct canals running parallel to the falls where the river could not be effectively cleared. Such a project is what brought Henry Latrobe to the Susquehanna River in September of 1801. In July 1801, Thomas McCain contracted with Colonel Frederick Antes to direct the survey and clearing of the lower Susquehanna. Antes in turn appointed Henry Latrobe, his nephew, as engineer and surveyor of the river from Columbia to the Pennsylvania-Maryland state line. In September, Antes became ill and died. Before his death, Antes shared with his nephew all of the information on the river that he had gathered in July and August. Antes also shared the networks of landowners and contractors he'd hired to begin clearing the river channels. Latrobe would succeed his uncle as director of the project. In Maryland, the Susquehanna Canal Company chose Sebastian Shade, an experienced navigator, and Christian Odecour, an engineer, to conduct the survey from the state line to the Chesapeake Bay. Latrobe worked closely with both Shade and Odecour through the fall of 1801 to finalize the survey and oversee the clearing of river channels. The Susquehanna is one of the major river systems in eastern North America. From its headwaters at Stego Lake in Cooperstown, New York, the river travels 444 miles to Havre de Grace, Maryland. The river cuts down the middle of Pennsylvania, its tributaries draining half of the state's surface area. The Susquehanna was a significant boundary line for English settlement until the 18th century. After that, settlers used river valleys throughout the Susquehanna watershed to make their way into the backcountry. Once settlements were established, farmers and merchants used wooden keel boats or arks to float their goods to downriver market towns. However, traveling the Susquehanna was always difficult and dangerous. The river is shallow, the banks are steep, and at the fall zone, ribs of rock randomly stretch across the river, making it difficult for boatmen to navigate the unobstructed channels. The fall zone is a gorge roughly 40 miles in length, stretching from Columbia to Conowingo Falls in Maryland, where the riverbed drops to sea level. And this top map illustration, that is the first section of Latrobe's map. I've broken the map into 3 different sections, so these next 3 slides show you different sections of the map. And the watercolors below are images taken from the area depicted in the map above. During the winter months, Latrobe worked to complete a hand-drawn watercolor map of the Susquehanna. The finished Susquehanna River Survey map is as much a work of art as it is a technical rendering of a river survey. This map is 17 feet long and 2 feet wide, thus breaking it into 3 slides. It included information on the locations of the islands, the rocks, the shoals, and Latrobe marked the cleared channels, which I don't think that, yes, you can see these red lines. If you see red lines, that's how he marked the cleared channels of the river. Let's see. In addition to this basic information for navigation, Latrobe included information on the vegetation, the agricultural development of the river valley, and the geology of the shoreline down to the Maryland line. Today, this map, together with Latrobe's survey report, the field notes, the sketches, the watercolors, and the correspondence, provides us with a unique storyboard of life and work in the lower Susquehanna River Valley in 1801. The original map was presented to Governor McCain in March 1802. Later, the map hung in the U.S. House of Representatives to promote federal funding of internal improvements. And I'll note that Latrobe designed that chamber. In 1814, the map still hanging in the House chamber was destroyed when the British burned the US Capitol. The map that survives today is part of the Benjamin Henry Latrobe collection at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, was Latrobe's personal copy. On November 21st, 1809, Latrobe replied to an inquiry from an old acquaintance he first met in July of 1796. He wrote, "Your politeness to me 12 or 13 years ago is not forgotten, and it gives me pleasure to find by your letter that you are still alive and in good health. Richard Bate was a merchant in Petersburg with an interest in various ongoing schemes to improve the navigation along the Appomattox River. Over the intervening years, progress on the improvement project stalled. Bates, on behalf of the Lower Appomattox Navigation Company, contacted Latrobe to ask for his advice on clearing and deepening the river from the falls at Petersburg to Broadway Landing, just west of City Point on the James River. The body of this letter demonstrates the most important lessons Latrobe learned about the rivers while living and working throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed." And now that's the whole map. Latrobe wrote, "But how to advise you in your projected undertaking? I am utterly at a loss, and the more so as my experience as one of the commissioners of the state of Pennsylvania for the improvement of the navigation of the Susquehanna has taught me that a thorough knowledge of the river in all stages of rise and fall is necessary on each particular spot before it can be judged whether a very plausible scheme of improvement in one state of the river may not be an absolute obstruction in another." It had been over a decade since Latrobe last saw the Appomattox. 13 years of experience taught him that the Chesapeake rivers changed quickly and often with each season, each flood, and each drought. Latrobe understood that the rivers, long or short, had different geological stories to tell. The local knowledge of the rivers and an understanding of how the people used them was often paramount to generalized scientific and technical knowledge. In general, obstructions in the Chesapeake rivers, Latrobe explained, are either rocks or shoals. Rocks, especially where the river is deep, can be removed, but the shoals make up part of the river's bed and change over time. When the river is flowing at an average level, boats may be able to float over the shoals. But where the water is shallow, either because of drought or the nature of the riverbed itself, boats cannot pass. Each river has its own unique characteristics, which must be studied carefully over time before decisions can be made and work can begin. In closing, Latrobe stressed that to understand the power of the river, to underestimate the power of the river was not just foolhardy, it was dangerous. He writes, "The shoals have a natural cause in the direction and rapidity of the stream at or near the spot where they are deposited. To remove the rocks so as not to lower the water above the rapid or fall requires much judgment, especially in so small a stream as the Appomattox. Each rock calls for its separate consideration. In the Susquehanna, it was not easy to make such an opening anywhere as would not materially shoal the river above it. However, I guarded against it and always obstructed as much as I opened. My great principle was to cut the channel over the rapid close to the shore, so as to make the simple rule of hugging the shore in all stages of the river a sufficient guide to the boatman. To do this, I had in one place to remove rock, some of them 30 feet high, for near a mile in length. As to the shoals, it is impossible to give directions for their permanent removal from a distance. Still more to lay down general rules on the subject. The watercolors of the lower Susquehanna River Valley that make up Latrobe's storyboard of the survey, together with the completed survey map, give visual form to the advice given in this letter. The sketches and watercolors were in fact an integral part of Latrobe survey practice. Every bit as valuable to understanding the life of the river as the more technical field notes. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for holding out this final paper. I'll stick to time here. Yeah, let me begin. In the shadows of St Paul's Cathedral in 1790s London, a bookseller named Joseph Johnson provided a hub for dissenters and radicals. Readers would find books on abolition, prison reform, and education, alongside publications by Thomas Paine and Joseph Priestley, and including your text on influenza, Al. In 1792, one of the most important proto-feminist texts of the 18th century was sold there, Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women. This was not the only path-breaking text written by a woman stopped by Johnson. Two years later, in 1794, Elizabeth Fulham's An Essay on Combustion arrived. Proto-feminist in its own right, the book was more substantially an act of proto-photography, a landmark moment in the development of an emergent field. The work rapidly became known in chemical circles in her lifetime. Fulham donated a copy to the Royal Society Library in January of 1795, and two to the Royal Irish Academy, and that same year, a copy was also donated by the author to the American Philosophical Society. Clearly, Fulham knew who she wanted her audience to be, and she chose it carefully. By 1798, she'd been made a corresponding member of the Chemical Society of Philadelphia, and her book was translated and republished in German. By 1810, an American edition appeared in Philadelphia. Fulham was reviewed across several outlets where her work was championed and critiqued, not just as a work on chemistry, but as a transgression of the gendered boundaries of science and scholarship. Although her contributions to the field of chemistry are well established, the significance of her influence in photochemistry warrants more attention. Writing in 1991, Geoffrey Batchen suggested that the declaration of the invention of photography in 1839 came in the slipstream of 4 decades of proto-photographic inquiry, involving as many as 20 individuals from 7 different countries: Brazil, Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Switzerland, and the United States. These proto-photographers, as he names them, all shared a pursuit of the photographic process of one kind or another, and one of them was Elizabeth Fulham. So this paper considers Fulham's contributions as overlooked in the invention of the medium. And today I want to locate Fulham within a network of proto-photographic thinkers and practitioners in the late 18th century Edinburgh to consider the relations in which her work was entangled. So her key photographic contributions were in the domain of photochemical imaging. Her work followed the discovery that silver salts would blacken under the influence of light. And it was sometime between 1780 and 1793 she explored the reduction of metals by light and the consequent formation of images. Her major breakthrough was to establish a rudimentary image on dyed materials using the effect of light on photochemical solutions of gold and silver, and she was seemingly the first to do so. Conducting her chemical experiments at home in Edinburgh and later publishing her texts in London, she traversed the gender distinction between handcraft and science. The culture of 18th century experimentation was profoundly domestic for all proto-photographers, but unlike her contemporaries, as a woman, she had no alternative. So it was therefore in the domestic setting, with fabric, silks, and light, that her proto-photographic experiments were enacted and shared. The breakthroughs that flowed from these experiments would form part of the bedrock of the invention of photography, announced by François Arago some 45 years later in Paris. So this is a project beset by the limitations of the archive, where no physical photographic works of Fulhame's remain. She belonged in an age before photochemical images could be made permanent. So when the coloured silks and fibres of paper no longer exist, when the photochemical colours can only be imagined, an assessment of fugitive work such as hers and its role in shaping the invention of photography presents significant challenges. So these are some of my own very loose chemical reenactments of Fulhame's experiments. They were made in the field of art practice to give me a better sense of the colour shifts of her chemical experiments and the fugitive nature of them. Unlike Bancroft, there's no permanency of colour in these. In fact, the colour's not really coming through in the projection. Fulhame's often grouped as being both a scientific pioneer and at the same time an unsung hero, a mysterious case, invisible and faded from history. And while her work would later be excised from the 20th century canon on photography, this was not the case as the field was emerging a century prior. Indeed, her photochemical contributions were widely recognised in some of the earliest accounts of photography, and perhaps most significantly in John Herschel's delivery to the Royal Society Note on the Art of Photography. This is 1839, this is just weeks after the formal declaration of the invention of photography, and Herschel made his first address on the subject. And in this landmark moment at the Royal Society, Herschel mentioned Fulhame by name in the opening paragraphs. Here we are. So the significance of Herschel's inclusion cannot be underestimated. It places a woman at the moment of invention there, at the very beginning, in fact, before the beginning. Fulhame's work was also widely reviewed in the immediate aftermath of its publication. But despite this early recognition, her contributions were forgotten as the dominance of Talbot and Daguerre came to prevail. Other than a singular citation in 1905 by Joseph Eder, who recognised her work as original and important, her contribution to photography was largely ignored from the mid-19th century right through to the close of the 20th. So this paper is driven by new and ongoing archival research conducted here in Philadelphia. Its main concern is to situate Fulhame within the context and cultural conditions in which she conducted her photochemical contributions, and to gain a deeper understanding of her readership and influence. In doing so, a new understanding can be gleaned about the impact of her experiments on her contemporaries, particularly those who continue to be given a more prominent place in the literature. So the existing scholarship on Fulhame is characterised by its cautious, uncertain and inconclusive tone. I include my own writing within that. Terms such as perhaps, probably, presumably are regularly used to describe her in secondary materials, and for very good reason. Key elements of Fulhame's biography remain fragmented, untraceable, and unknown. So to assess her contributions to photography today, I'll touch on three themes. The significance of 18th century Edinburgh as a site of her work's making, the scientific networks that she navigated, and the influence she had on her contemporaries and those who drew on her work in her lifetime. Philadelphia plays a crucial chapter in Fulhame's biography, and therefore by extension, the history of early photochemistry. However, to appreciate the centrality of Philadelphia, we must first turn to 1780s Edinburgh. Here I stand at what is called the Cross of Edinburgh and can take in a few minutes, take 50 men of genius and learning by the hand. But what of the women? In this time, Edinburgh was a pole of attraction for students from England, Ireland, and beyond. In chemistry in particular, Edinburgh was at the forefront of a new and experimental approach, which would soon come to dominate, not just domestically, but in the United States also. This was a period in which the city was considered preeminent in philosophy, medicine, and science. And just yesterday, we heard papers from Adam and Mike with a focus on the students who studied there. Two men in particular were synonymous with the teaching, William Cullen and Joseph Black. And it's Black that I'd like to discuss briefly. Pioneering chemist, making discoveries in carbon dioxide and latent heat, his lectures were attended not just by university students, but intellectuals and practitioners across Edinburgh. Among Black's pupils were names perhaps more familiar to this audience than in Scotland: John Maclean, John Morgan, John Redmond Cox, and Benjamin Rush, who'd each established their own courses in the United States. Another student of Black was Thomas Fulhame, Elizabeth's husband. Now, in the preface to her single text in 1794, she wrote, the possibility of making cloths of gold, silver, and other metals by chemical processes occurred to me in the year 1780. The project being mentioned to Dr. Fulhame and some friends was deemed improbable. So to question who these friends were, returning to black is productive. In 1785, black students founded what's considered to be the world's first chemical society. And I'd like to advance the idea that this society carries significance for the history of photography too, for understanding Fulhame as part of that emergent field. So these networks include Tom Wedgwood, James Watt, Henry Broome, Thomas Beddoes, all key figures in early photography, but crucially, I argue, all part of the network within which Fulhame can be located. And by the time of their protophotographic activity in the late 1790s, her work had already been in circulation for several years. So I want to suggest that not only was her work in their orbit, but they also engaged with it. So University of Edinburgh at the close of the 18th century. According to Anderson and Jones, a steady stream of English nonconformists and quite a few Anglicans sought their medical education in Scotland, with Edinburgh being a particularly attractive destination because of the high reputation it enjoyed for teaching. One such individual was Thomas Beddoes, who lived in the city for 1 year in 1784. When Beddoes arrived, Edinburgh contrasted markedly with the intellectual climate at Oxford, where the dispersion of students and professors with the general public and Edinburgh society offered something favourable, essentially offering a more normal way of living. 2 years after Beddoes, in the autumn of 1786, 15-year-old Tom Wedgwood joined his older brother Josiah in Edinburgh. Tom and his brother lived on West Nicholson Street. This is somewhere that I've located just a few hundred metres from the Fulhames, who were located on the same stretch of road, now demolished, but known as Bristol Street. So just as Tom Wedgwood was settling into his home in Edinburgh, Fulhame was already undertaking her own experiments within close walking distance. So there's a striking proximity here that's not been identified before. Here we have a small entry ticket bearing the inscription Lectures in Chemistry from the Wedgwood collection at the V&A. And this is providing a material trace of Wedgwood's participation in Black's lectures. Again, something that could never exist for Fulhame. Tom Wedgwood, son to the wealthy industrialist, not only had access to state-of-the-art laboratories, but soon after his arrival in Edinburgh, his tutor, Alexander Chisholm, wrote to Tom from his family home. The classes in chemistry will, in my opinion, employ all of your time. I hope Dr. Black speaks to the eye as well as to the ear, even though that is not so good as doing a thing with one's own hand. Your laboratory shall be taken care of. So in these 18th century sources, the significance of learning through making is clear, one's own hand, but also the privilege Wedgwood enjoyed in having access to both a laboratory and a tutor, clearly evident. Despite Fulhame's experiments predating Wedgwood's, he's widely recognised as the pioneering figure in protophotography. His landmark moment coming in June 1802, when his experiments were presented by Humphrey Davy to the Royal Institution. These are usually regarded as the first to have photography as their principal object. Now, Wedgwood's significance is not in doubt. In coating white paper and white leather with light-sensitive chemicals, silver chloride, to capture silhouette images, he was attempting to photograph using a camera obscura. But something to consider is that a young Wedgwood could have been conceptualising the beginnings of early protophotographic experiments in Edinburgh, while Fulhame, in her domestic setting, was already working with silver salts and silk, all in the same city on a continuous street a few hundred metres apart. These are some camera obscuras that I've made. I'm happy to return to and talk about this. Though a capital city, Edinburgh was compact, and its intellectual networks even more tightly entwined. Everybody in cultivated circles knew everybody else. The significance of Edinburgh in Wedgwood's protophotography remains neglected. The possibility that Fulhame and Wedgwood knew each other, were in touch, or moved in the same protophotographic circles is something I'll continue to explore. So, as I've mentioned, the distinguishing feature of Wedgwood's experiments was the employment of a camera obscura. There's clear photographic intent. This is chemistry and optics. Fulhame doesn't fit so neatly into this standardised photographic category. But for Fulhame, the key photochemical element of her work was the production of maps with rivers formed of silver by action of light. Her aims were in making pieces of gold cloth as large as my finances would admit, and in making maps to facilitate the study of geography. The making of these maps constitutes for Ware one of the earliest examples of photochemical imaging. So I want to insist that the category of the photographic be stretched to include Fulham, and that increasingly there's archival sources which suggest her photochemical investigations predated and potentially inspired Wedgwood's. However, in the moment of drawing these connections, I'm cautioned by the archive. Fulham does not mention black by name at any point in her text. Instead, she writes, "Were I not encouraged by the judgment of some friends and possessed of specimens to show the progress made in the art, I should never perhaps venture to publish this essay." Unfortunately, these friends are not named, and the particulars of the specimens are not described by her. In the introduction to her text, she presents a range of citations which show that she's undoubtedly immersed in chemical theory, but the protophotographers discussed in this paper so far are absent. She does, however, cite a celebrated philosopher who, sometime in October 1793, after seeing some of the pieces, and indeed some of the worst, viewed the performance in a very different light. And though she doesn't name it in that particular passage, we know that this was Joseph Priestley. And it's in this encounter with Priestley, cited widely in the Fulham literature, that re-establishes Fulham's place in chemical history. Now, portraits of Priestley have surrounded me here in Philadelphia for good reason. He's committed to the interrelation between scientific knowledge, social reform, between chemistry and public culture. And as mentioned yesterday, he was a member of the Lunar Society, a small group of scientists and industrialists, including Watt and Josiah Wedgwood, both of whom were intimately connected to black and the world of protophotography in Edinburgh. At the Lunar Society, discussions were held about the action upon nitrate of silver and the application of this phenomenon to the production of pictures. In short, protophotography. And this leads me to my research undertaken here in Philadelphia. The Priestley papers at APS date from a crucial period where he and Fulham met and referenced each other's work. After the Birmingham riots, when he left for London and settled in Lower Clapton, he would stay there until early 1794 before he emigrated here to Pennsylvania. And I mention this well-known history as significantly it's in this period, in the early 1790s, when tangible evidence emerges that the world of Fulham and the protophotographic network sketched in this paper overlap. So like I say, it was in October 93 that Fulham met with Priestley in London, and she showed him samples of her work, essentially colour photochemical experiments. And Priestley notes this encounter with Fulham in this essay published in 1800, where he writes, "She was so obliging as to show me the result of some of them in London. I was greatly struck with them." And Fulham also reflects on her exchange with Priestley in the preface to her work, where she recounts after showing him the examples that it was he that surprised her to pursue the project to the point of publication. And you can see here that she's saying the idea was floated about presenting to the Royal Society, but different incidents dissuaded me from that mode of publication. Had this happened, this would have been the first experimental paper published in a woman's name at the Royal Society. This honour does, however, go to another protophotographer of my studies, Mary Somerville. Her book was registered in Stationers' Hall, and for a long period, this was the first and only known record where her forename appears in print. At least it almost does. But the encounter with Priestley represents a crucial point of contact between Fulham and the world of protophotography. And I want to propose that the Edinburgh connections established in this paper provide a key and overlooked backdrop to their encounter, one in which a circle of thinkers and practitioners can be located that encompass several key figures in the world of protophotography. And just prior to Fulham's meeting with Priestley, he was also in correspondence with Tom Wedgwood. I've got some quotes of that within the longer paper, but just to make it transparent, during this London period, Priestley was simultaneously both encouraging Tom Wedgwood and Elizabeth Fulham in their pursuits, where they were sharing their work with them. After the publication of her text, Fulham's influence extending well beyond Edinburgh, from London to France and Germany, and by 1798 it reached the United States, where she was made a corresponding member of the Chemical Society of Philadelphia. To mark her newly acquired membership of the Society, Thomas Peter Smith, in his address, declared Mrs. Fulham has now laid such bold claims to chemistry that we can no longer deny the sex the privilege in participating in this science also. And following in the footsteps of Black students, the Chemical Society of Philadelphia was founded in 1792, most likely by John Redmond Cox, again a student of Blacks. And though the Philadelphia Society came after its Edinburgh counterpart, it certainly preceded it in its inclusion of women. In 1799, a year after Fulham was made a corresponding member of the Society, James Woodhouse, then chair of chemistry at the University of Pennsylvania, cited her enthusiastically. The celebrated Miss Fulham, a lady I'm proud to quote on this occasion, is the only person I know who seems properly impressed with the idea of the agency of water in many chemical operations. This distinguished lady, who is an example of her sex and an ornament of science. I mean, these are her supporters. And Woodhouse was also a member of the Chemical Society, shared his paper through the APS, and in transactions that year for the APS, as you all know here, but the members include Jefferson as president, Benjamin Rush as one of the 3 vice presidents. And where this is not news to you, it's helpful just to reiterate that given the company in which her work is being shared, it becomes difficult to sustain the idea that Fulham should be understood as a straightforwardly marginalised figure. So by 1810, I've mentioned an American edition of her book was published here in Philadelphia by James Humphreys. And an anonymous preface was written for the edition, lamenting the fate of her work and expressing hope that it would be recognised better here. The preface to this edition is thought to be most likely written by Thomas Cooper, who was living in Priestley's house in Northumberland around the time that Priestley was re-engaging with Fulham's work. Today I've been wanting to begin a conversation to identify and locate the influence of Fulham in photographic circles from Edinburgh to Philadelphia. But in establishing fragments of Fulham's life, who wrote her anonymous reviews, who wrote the preface to her US edition of her book, and who nominated her for a membership at the Chemical Society, can help to build a clearer picture of her contribution to and her influence on the field of early photography. In an article published almost 70 years ago now on the history of the Chemical Society of Philadelphia, Hepburn stated that 16 of its members also became members of APS. So I feel that here in Philadelphia, there must be a significant number of untapped sources that I'm yet to consult. And just using this chance to say, should anyone know more about James Humphreys, the publisher, or more on the Chemical Society of Philadelphia, I'd love to learn more. But I'll conclude here. By the close of the 18th century, a network of photographic activity in Edinburgh was forming. Until now, Fulham's place in that network has not been appreciated. Indeed, the very fact that Edinburgh was a hub of such activity has not been acknowledged, and the strong ties between Edinburgh and Philadelphia are increasingly present in the course of this research. Excluded from learned societies on the account of her gender, it appears that by 1797, she'd found some of her supporters, and they were Edinburgh-based, connected to Black, and Philadelphia-based and close to Priestley. So from Johnson to Priestley, Beddoes to Benjamin Thompson, Davy to James Woodhouse and the APS, Fulham's work was circulated, referenced and championed in her lifetime. My research is setting out not to inflate the importance of her, but rather to locate her and her influence. And the sources that I'm working through at the moment present a women's domestic sphere as a site of production of chemical and protophotographic activity. And there's brilliant references to gold stuff being touched and handled in her home of protophotography, also inspiring others in the making of their activities. So it's in tracing these networks and the experiments in which they were shared and tracking the influence she had on her contemporaries, the light that once displayed its full colour spectrum to the early pioneers of photography can begin to represent itself once more. Thank you.
Okay, how's the volume? Good? Okay, I'll just sort of lean toward the microphone. Thank you so much to our 4 wonderful panelists and the papers we've heard today. It is really a challenge to offer a comment that can do justice to all 4 of these radically different papers that covered a lot of different topics. So I'll just do my best to present sort of 2 thematic clusters that's struck me as I read the papers and also hearing them today. And the first of these is sight. It's in the title of the panel. So we have Marvels of Science and Sight. Sight, image, color, all of these things were very much present in all 4 of the papers. So sight is one of these thematic ideas that I came up with. The second is the concept of reenactment and enactment. And I kind of, it's a bit loose, but I'll just go through the ways that sort of reenactment appeared in each of these papers. So first we saw Sean Silver actually reenacting 18th century chemistry for us, producing the yellows, the drab yellows. So this is a reenactment of 18th century chemistry, also reenacting the material traces of a newly globalized British Empire whose extraction of natural resources directly added this drab color to a cultural palette. So that was a very direct reenactment. Then we have in Al Coppola's work, Katterfelto appears to cast himself as lead actor in the drama of spectacular natural philosophy with a side of quackery. But there's also the reenactment of his quote unquote wonders by the satirical Dr. Caterpillar. So we have, Katterfelto reenacted by Dr. Caterpillar. There's this sort of reiteration going on. Then we have Mary Richie McGuire showed us how Latrobe and others, in a sense, reenacted, tell me if this is a stretch, but reenacted a very familiar British landscape of rivers and geographies as they surveyed a new American geography. So there's a kind of recasting of what they see in the US in British terms that are familiar, at the same time coming up against very different phenomena, like the fall line, the shelf of granite that you so eloquently described. Then, in Caroline Douglas's work, we see Fulhame and her contemporaries enacting and reenacting photochemical processes as her experiments are reiterated and thus verified by her scientific communities. And we also know that Caroline Douglas has herself reenacted some of these photochemical experiments, as we saw in the very beginning. So the 2 questions that I want to give our panelists derive from these kind of themes. And the first is the question of witnessing an audience. And so from the idea of sight implies somebody who is seeing, it implies an audience or a witness. And so I wanted to ask the question of audience, basically, which appears in various forms in each of the papers that we've heard. So from quercitron yellow, don't know if I'm saying that right, to the caterpillars that are magnified to the size of an ox by Katterfelto, to these placid drawings of fall lines and fall line towns, to Fulhame's photochemical fabrics that are no longer existing. All of these images imply, imagine, or even possibly require a viewer or audience to make sense of them or to quote unquote read them, as these panelists have done for us. So I wonder if each of you might be able to comment further on this question of kind of audience, viewer for your work. And in other words, what role does sight, image and color, the act of witnessing, and audience play in the production of scientific knowledge in each of your cases? So that's question 1, very history of science, very nerdy question. Question 2, I want to return to this idea of performance and reenactment to ask you, what does reenactment and performance have to do with the science of the period? But then also, what does it have to do with your own practice as historians of science, as some of you have reenacted various elements of the subjects you've studied? So I'll leave you with those 2 questions since we're a bit short on time, and turn it over to the panelists. And I don't know if we have a microphone that will circulate.
They're up in the ceiling.
Oh, great. Okay. Okay, so just project.
I'll say a few words about reenactment. I mean, I prefer either reconstruction or recreation because it hovers right on the edge of like recreation. Just to say, I mean, 2 things. The first is that the first literary example of a reconstructor or a reenactor is Uncle Toby in Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy. In the last 5 years, I've been laboring to reconstruct or reenact the chemistry that goes into having made that book, in the full knowledge that that Stern's mild satire that falls on Uncle Toby, who ends up obsessed over reenacting or reconstructing the siege where he received the wound to his groin, and then a series of other historical sieges provides a kind of a ironic first instance for what it is that I'm undertaking. But as a historical methodology, like the colors that are being reconstructed here, like literally cannot be seen. The question about olive drab, about the uniforms from the 19 teens, early 20th century, that no longer look the way that they did, because drab, it turns out, is quite fugitive. I mean, it lasts for a couple of years and then it fades. The only way to see those colors is to reconstruct them, which of course we can do, and see them the way that they were. But also as a methodology, it's really a way of talking about globalism. Chemistry asks us always to keep two. I mean, if we're doing it historically, it asks us always to keep two scales in touch with one another. I mean, on the one hand, the very smallest scale, because we're modifying materials at a microscopic level that we can't see directly. But on the other hand, like the global scale, because stuff comes from stuff, which means that if we're thinking about drab, we're really thinking about, on the one hand, what occurred temporally a couple hundred years ago in Calcutta, and on the other hand, what's happening contemporaneously on the North American mainland. So that becomes then a historiographic methodology, since it's asking us, it just following, reconstructing the chemistry takes us to the kinds of narratives that we wind up telling.
I guess how, in thinking about the role of the audience in the production of scientific knowledge and the experiences created, it's very complicated, because there's a whole tradition of science lectures that would mix in thrilling sort of spectacles with a pretty reasonably grounded sort of curriculum that would actually instruct you with lots of forms of modern experimental science. Now we have Katterfelto sort of in the public marketplace of spectacles. Down the way, there's horseback presentations. There's a huge sort of there's Graham with his electrical stuff going on. It's a huge sort of market of wonders there, but it's definitely certain that many people had never seen the microscopic world until they went to his solar microscope performances. He's doing it out of step. He didn't do it at night. He had to do it during the day. But it's so urgent, so interesting that he's pulling on audiences to see this. And so there is sort of some kind of knowledge being produced there. But of course, it's very cynical. He's looking to sort of enrich himself. And I think about, like, in terms of enactment and reenactment, everybody's getting sick in the spring, and there was plenty of concern that this was a terrible thing, and maybe these caterpillars really are bringing a new disease in. But by the end of the summer, when the farces start to come out, the Playhouse, the infection had sort of run its course, and so the rhetoric of this seemed safe, I guess, or enjoyable to sort of return to, but to run it again as farce, but sort of sustain it. And I guess it also made me think of the wonderful paper that Aaron McCleary gave yesterday about the sort of the remediation and overwriting and sort of active sort of distortion and forgetting of the Legionnaire's disease sort of episode. And I think that, I haven't put all these pieces together, but it reminds me of that as well.
Okay, these themes of sight, reenactment, enactment, witness, audience, really do apply to Latrobe. And the way I first learned about Latrobe was in art history class as an undergraduate. So I'm coming to the history of science, not from a scientific field, but art history and history for my BA degree. So one of the questions I had about Latrobe when looking at these watercolors was, how accurate was he? That was a big question to me, because I knew that he was a follower of Reverend William Gilpin's picturesque movement. He owned a copy of Reverend Gilpin's book on the picturesque, and he discussed Gilpin's ideas with other Americans that he corresponded with. So Historians look to Latrobe's work as just illustrations. And once I sort of actually started hiking around where Latrobe had been in Virginia and realizing that he really had placed himself in this spot and done an accurate landscape of Richmond from that spot on Belle Isle, I can take you there today. It was amazing, and I thought, well, maybe this isn't just Latrobe's artwork, but maybe it really is part of his scientific practice and the way he records information about the landscape and the natural world around him. And that's how I came to this presentation and my dissertation. Audience, I think that these sketchbooks and his journals were private. These were doing a watercolor was the way he took notes for himself so he could remember. Just like he took field notes. In fact, the sketchbooks that document his Atlantic crossing have all sorts of wonderful scientific notes just tucked in with these sketches. They're absolutely beautiful. So that was my aim in the talk, is to get you all to think about these sketches as being legitimate forms of scientific information. And that's what I'm trying to do with my dissertation.
Yeah, just to answer that, I mean, sight, image, and color are really central to my thesis. Territory of the entire project. In the case of Fulhame, her work was really an invitation to reenactment. And within the text, you know, she describes the full colour spectrum that she's experiencing, the role of her breath in the making of the works. You know, it's like a haptic text. So in my case, I guess reenactment is one of my like artistic methodologies. So as I'm reading it, I'm just thinking, I need to try that. I've got to do this. What you find in the case of Fulhame, this is a sort of prevailing theme, that the citations that you have, they're always resigned to the footnote, and they're extremely dry, but and they're never sufficient. But they are people who have reenacted her work, and it's brought their new mode of research about. It's clearly citing her as a source of inspiration, and the excitement actually lies in the private letters that are exchanged. Unsurprisingly, that's where those conversations of colour and discovery are all contained. So I suppose, yeah, reenactment was sort of an artistic method of mine, just to get a better sense of not only the visuality of the sources, but the kind of the smells and how permanent, fugitive that they were. But it was also something really constructive in that process. And one of my other chapters I've written on Mary Somerville's experiments, it was actually in reenacting some of her works. These are colour amphotypes of vegetable dyes, turmeric, and it was in making those works at home. I'd only been able to obtain the sources digitally online, and I just got a copy of her notebook. But after making the works myself, and the residue that I was left with and the test strips, I wrote back to the Bodleian just to say, could I come and view that notebook? And then within them, there were actual photographic test strips that had never been digitized. And had I not gone through the process of the reenactment in art practice, never would have been searching for that.
Well, those were some really fascinating, beautiful answers to these questions. I think we're kind of running out of time for this panel, so I just want to consult with the organizers if we're going to move to discussion or if we have time.
We have time. I think what we should do here, because this is like the wrap-up period that we're now sort of officially in. So I think it makes sense for us. We'll leave this group still up here. So if there's sort of questions that, and so especially if there's questions for these panelists, please feel free to ask them, but I think we also want to think about how to tie this together and wrap it up. And Adriana and I were chatting, and we pulled up Judy's questions from last night from the keynote, because we agreed that they're a really helpful frame, I think, especially when we're thinking through where Samantha so helpfully left us off around recreation and audience into these questions of commemoration that I think we're asking around these topics of science in the age of revolutions and what we do going into the 250th. So I think we'll sort of open it up in that way. So if you have sort of specific questions for this panel, that's great too, because we want to allow time for that. But if there are sort of broader questions that we want to have as a group, I think those are also welcome in this space too.
Or reflections or observations too. Especially for folks who haven't had a chance to speak, if you've just been here and listening, it'd actually be great to hear from you as others hung out for the last year. Cameron, go for it.
Hi, so great panel. Sorry, there wasn't time for more discussion specifically on it, but this sort of ties into the question last night that someone in the back asked about like patriotism and such too, and it ties into these questions as well. And it's sort of about cast of characters in this, like really remarkably in the last few days, like we've heard very little about, Benjamin Franklin or Benjamin Rush. I mean, the names have come up and such. Instead we get like Katterfelto, right? And I think Joseph Priestley may have been the most mentioned person here. It's really interesting. And it sort of suggests sort of where these things might be going in terms of, what is revolutionary about science and the revolution, right? So I sort of throw that out there as a question, for the panelists to make sure they have a time to expound about like, at a conference like this, you sort of expect it to be like a state of the field and sort of like, where are we right now? And it seems kind of all over the place. A lot of these weren't even, about the United States, and that's great. But sort of taking all that into consideration and like the sort of very interesting actors that you guys are looking at here, like how do you see, the dramatis personae of science during the revolution, right? And like, what does that tell us about the field that we're all more or less working in?
Well, I'll go first. I'll just say Katterfelto, activates a lot of things, or we see in that episode a lot of things that we're with, this sort of public contestation of scientific authority. If anything, the sort of unwillingness of being dragged, kicking and screaming to the public square to sort of have to say, no, actually, we kind of know how flu works. We kind of know how these caterpillars work, and they're not the same. Joseph Banks is very reluctant to do anything, and he has a sort of colleague sort of step up and do that. And maybe because he intuited that now you're competing in a marketplace of spectacle and not a sort of forum of sort of reasoned debate or something like that, where authority matters. And Katterfelto sort of breaks that apart and discovers that there's lots to be gained from that kind of chaos. He gets to be quite wealthy and quite well known, and it seems like lots and lots of people are content to sort of leave it there, and that the legitimate public health concerns just sort of fade into the background for this sort of farce that sort of spins out. And I think that's interesting, and it does connect to other thoughts that we've had about the ways in which sort of scientific sociability was activated and in sort of certain kinds of political formations and political socializing that was radical and destabilizing. And I think that we see something like that in Katterfelto.
Building off what Cameron said, I think I like that Michelle opened up last night with this idea of this cast of characters that might be familiar to us, but might be kind of blank slates to a lot of the public. Thinking about like literacy and opera is it operationalism? I don't know. I probably just made that word up. But I think the fact that people don't carry as much baggage around these people, that they might allow us to communicate ideas and information in new ways. Not only are they going to meet a new cast of characters in this period, but also we can use that cast of characters to get new ideas across to where someone like John Adams or Ben Franklin, people have these ideas of them already, but they don't have as many ideas of these other people. So that might allow us to kind of like bring new ideas and new casts in. So That's what I've seen is I've learned about a lot of people today and yesterday as well. So
Harry.
Since Joseph Priestley is sort of my subject matter area of interest, and many people who now know that. So Edward Bancroft intercepts a Priestley letter to Ben Franklin in Paris, copies it, gives it to the British Embassy, and it almost costs Lord Shelburne his life in a duel in Hyde Park days later. So Bancroft, almost kills Priestley's boss because of his espionage activities.
yeah,
It's striking, the intersections there. But Priestley wore many hats. He starts out as a Presbyterian minister, becomes a Unitarian, gets kicked out of the Presbyterian church, becomes an educator, becomes famous as an educator before he does any science, right? And every one of these presentations cover aspects of Priestley's interest areas, but the Scottish Enlightenment, which Carolyn is really alluding to, as well as the Philadelphia Enlightenment, there's a lot of overlap. So Priestley, in a sense, is a great persona drawing together all these threads. He's an intimate of Benjamin Franklin's. Bancroft was a member of APS as well. Edward Bancroft is a member of this organization, I believe. Pardon me?
well, we can check.
I think he was.
We'll check the database.
Yeah, we can check.
Yeah, I think he was. So the idea of enlightenment, of new breakthroughs in science, but also in many other fields, all kind of is pulled together brilliantly, I think, by this conference and by its speakers. I've heard so much wonderful stuff, but I think there is an overarching theme here, which is a new era, an era of revolution, not just in a military sense or a political sense, but there's a chemical revolution too that many chemists here may have heard of. And Lavoisier, of course, is one of the pioneers of that. Priestley, ironically, is sort of one of the last surviving advocates of phlogiston theory, which Ms. Fulham was wise enough to reject, in some of the documents to present. But at the same time, the world is changing. It's changing rapidly, and it's changing in many, many, many different fields. And it's very dynamic and very fluid. And these panels, all of them in this conference, have just astonished me with their brilliance and their overarching, I think, eventually they are focusing. All of you are focusing. It may seem a little piecemeal, but in a sense, Priestley personifies that kind of, he was called a universal genius in his day, as was Ben Franklin. But I'm hearing a lot of that at this conference, and I want to thank everyone who participated and everyone who's been part of it. Thank you. For me, just fabulous.
Go ahead, Ellen.
One of the things I was thinking about during this panel, especially with Dr. Katterfelto and so on, is the role of the press. I mean, the extremely deft maneuvering to get publicity into the newspapers. And one thing that was just incredibly striking to me, that image you showed of the advertisement for the performance side in an adjacent column to other information. I mean, that's the editor of the newspaper. Putting them side by side in that way. And, Franklin obviously was famous at selling newspapers and figuring out what would capture the public's imagination. Almanacs went flying off the shelf, newspapers went flying off the shelf because he was so clever in the way that he presented information, organized it. So from there, one of the things that I've been thinking about that kind of relates to your larger questions is not just what was being done, but how knowledge was being disseminated. And public literacy depends on the methods of dissemination. And at this time, what were those methods? We've heard about correspondence. We've seen images of books that were published, and so on. Networks of gardeners talking to one another. I mean, on every kind of level, how is it that knowledge gets spread, and what is the process by which ideas that are floated in all kinds of ways? I mean, I was thinking about Anton Mesmer in Europe,
Sure.
who also was famous for quackery, but eventually was discredited by a commission of the top scientists in France applying experiments. I don't want to go on and on, but anyway, you get the idea of first elevating new ideas, which is what science is all about, to kind of general knowledge, and then the sifting process by which the wheat and the chaff get separated.
Very good.
That's
Hi, I'm not a scientist, I'm a retired lawyer, so I really enjoyed the last 2 days, but what's striking me is after 250 years of great science, that we're at a stage now where we have a government that has no interest in science, no interest in truth. You're looking at a revolution 250 years ago. We could be in the middle of a revolution right now where science doesn't matter. And we're going to be in real bad shape if it doesn't keep mattering. That's my thought.
Yeah. It's like slow clap.
And it's nice to see with the current notion that how we are evolving. I grew up in the 50s and 60s where we all wanted to be rocket scientists. Now we see that the STEM majors are on decline. And how are we going to react as a culture and how to make it popular again? And what's going to be difficult with social media is how to bring general population into this, understand the scientific process. We just saw with COVID how people misinterpreting science, and some studies that ivermectin works and they jump on it, they don't understand the process of validating that study. So seeing the history of science put a lot more perspective on it. Rotating through the halls in here and the joys of DDT and spraying it under the sink in your kitchen, as one of your posters out here show. Well, there are some bumps along the road, but that's our current dilemma: is how to bring this to the general population, and that's why this conference for me was great.
When I was teaching for the first time in grad school, I was teaching scientific revolution, and one of my students asked me in class kind of snarkily, "Why are you teaching us science that's wrong?" And I love that question though, because it's actually kind of brilliant. And I feel like that is part of the process that maybe we're hitting on here in this conversation. I love, as someone who's both like have one foot in the academic world, one foot in the public history museum world, that this conference also had that, because this communication of science question, like we have our heady academic, we're all raising our hands when we know these obscure figures, but the conversations I have every day at my job are on a very different level of understanding, and that's okay. But when I think about the, tiny little vaccine paper that I saw in the archive the other day with Ferronda saying, yes, it does work, this does work, but then there's so many things we've talked about where it's like, phlogiston, it doesn't actually work. And that's where I think we come in, is communicating how the process of science, yes, some things with DDT right now, we're not really going to go back to that, the eggshells, but that this process is one of constant questioning, and that there are some facts that we agree upon and there are questions we continue to ask, but how to empower the public to understand that without losing trust and faith in science. And I think that's the charge that we have now. And I hope all of you fellow brilliant people will take it on.
I think one of the biggest things we all have to face is the comment I always get, TLDR, too long, didn't read. And if you can't convey the steps that get you somewhere, that's it.
I think building off of that point, I mean, we have the logistics of a conference and we all need to give presentations, and all the presentations were brilliant, and thank you all for your work.
Speak up, it's hard to hear on the far side of the room.
Project, okay, I'll put my teacher voice on. Thank you all for your presentations, and to build off that comment about too long to read. You know, one thing that I was constantly struck by throughout all of the panels, and this is not to sort of like diminish the work here, is who noticeably is continually absent from these discussions. And it sort of came up in some presentations, like the enslaved men that are moving Latrobe up and down the river, the questions about apple orchards and Sullivan's campaign that came up earlier. But I think it's also part of our obligation about history in America and the roots of science in this country, that we include whose knowledge we're building off of and whose work is vitally important in helping arrive at some of these early conclusions that we then sort of tinker with and re-experiment with later. Yeah.
Can I say, I mean, one of the things that was really striking to me about this range of papers is I've been thinking about a way to make a single leaf of marbled paper interesting to people. And one of the first approaches I tried is just to link each reagent that's involved in that making to an individual person, right? Like tracing to a person. And that's I think but the range of different ways that people have made history present over the course of the panels that we've heard here, including tracing people, of course, like notable people, and sometimes sort of non-notable people as well, tracing materials, physical, biological, or mineral, tracing skills, tracing networks or relations, systems of relations, including letter networks and so on, economic histories. But also just to end with, I mean, for me, one of the things that I'm going to take away that's really striking was Carolyn's remark just now about really one of the advantages of being, to the extent to which we here are historians of science and historians of chemistry, is that the whole field of science or the field of chemistry is in fact an invitation to reenact, which is another way of answering the question that this actually belongs to all of us, because there is no scientific document that isn't an invitation to anybody just to engage in the discourse and try it out themselves. I'm really committed. That's what the Scarlet Letterpress is about, is to putting things in people's hands and then letting them try it themselves. So just another kind of way of thinking about like our obligations as historians also are not just to recover the people that earned the knowledge in the first place, but also to propagate the knowledge through the continual reenacting of
it. Just connecting a couple of these comments, thinking back to about the messiness element you were saying about science. And I was thinking about, Cameron asked that question that kind of hung in the room. Historians of science love to deconstruct science and to say that it's kind of constructed by people. It's not eternal truth. But then you're like, but we also want people to believe science is real. So what do we add at this moment? I think historians of science were much more confident in the 80s and 90s in the wake of Tuskegee experiments and all of the different sense that medical and scientific professionals spoke kind of godlike authority. And, so I think historians of science felt like they had kind of a mission. I think they feel a little floating around at this moment. But when I teach history of science, I've gravitated to texts that let students see science as constructed and then see how people can actually construct better, more just, more stable answers. You know what I'm saying? So it's not unmasking science, but showing the messiness of science and how it can work in good ways. So like a couple of texts that I've increasingly had my students that they really drawn to is, and I was thinking about the talk last night with Legionnaire's disease, is Michelle Murphy's Sick Building Syndrome book that explores the world of building science and air conditioning units, and how scientific labs are created to construct a particular science to make safe environments, but then how women office workers and others had to mobilize when they weren't taken serious. Some of you may know this book, but maybe it's the too long, not going to read type of thing. But my students, when they go through that, they both see science as constructed and then see people using the tools of science to win in ways that they like. And I think the same thing with Stephen Epstein's book about the AIDS crisis and the AIDS activists who changed how the NIH did those studies, right? So it doesn't unmask science as somehow, it shows that science was constructed for certain interests, and then groups use the tools of science to convince others to do new kinds of science. So I think those are the kinds of stories at this moment that my students and myself and others are probably eager for. The challenge is someone's gonna have to write, find those. But you think about the 18th century vaccine debates, there's a lot of all these panels, I feel like they could all, control of rivers, is hugely controversial about the science of rivers and controlling all of these kinds of things. But anyway, that was too long, but those are my thoughts about some of these things. Yeah.
I can sort of layer in here, and this comes largely off of your comments there. And I don't, this might come across sort of a terrifying way, which is that I actually think that like one of the enemies that I feel like we're up against right now is not just a crisis in expertise, but actually a crisis of certainty, by which I mean there's a lot of certainty masquerading as knowledge, right? So like ChatGPT is a great example of this, right? It's like tone of voice is certainty. And people interpret that as being knowledge. And what we've all actually been talking about this week is uncertainty. And these people who are inhabiting this space of uncertainty and asking questions and saying like, is this thing that I found here the same thing that you found here? We're ourselves modeling uncertainty as we say, how did Elizabeth Fulhame get to this? I don't know, let's go find out, right? And it just seems to me that, if I think about like, what do I want the public to know about the history of science? It's actually that uncertainty isn't a bad place to inhabit. And actually that uncertainty is where we get anywhere, and that learning only stops when we claim that we're certain about something. It seems like there's a real power in us modeling our own uncertainties, but also really exposing science as the story of uncertainty.
How do you deal with that? I mean, how do you deal with people who say, well, we're certain about Tylenol? And then you say, well, we're not so certain about it. There are, there's some possibilities that there may be some rare situations where there's a link, and there's not. But there's these people who say, well, we're certain about this. That's a challenge that all you guys that are this. I'm a health educator, so but you guys are the scientists that you got to get out there and I say be proselytizing. Anyway.
But maybe to add to that point, I think that that's really important, that there's a group of people in this room who are coming from so many different perspectives, who are interested in sort of communicating this message about the credibility of science, throughout America's and beyond's history. So, I think it's important for the health communicators, and especially trained historians of science, and the early Americanists and the art historians, and everybody who comes through this museum and all of these spaces to be thinking and communicating together about how to get these. So I think that perspective is really important in this conversation, and that's how it's going to happen. That's how the stories of failures and what we can learn from them are going to disseminate in the ways the editors used to in the past.
I'm seeing the clock tick to 4:29. And I think that probably as good a place to end as any. I want to thank everyone so much for participating in this really generative day and a half of conversations.
And so let's give us all